what the December eclipse augurs for 2022. Revolution. That's what this eclipse augurs. The mundane astrological portents indicate a cycle ending rather than a continuation of more of the same. So what we have here is culture wars, class wars, currency, technology wars, currency wars, cold wars. They're all raging right now. And the current postmodern system can't change. The current system in place that was implemented, it's not flexible. It cannot be upgraded. Either it's not being allowed to change, but it can't change, right? It's being restricted or it's too inflexible. So revolution is the only path forward. For it is no longer a question of if we get a socioeconomic revolution, but a question of when and how. For the mundane astrological portents indicate a cycle ending rather than a continuation of more of the same, but only worse. The year 2022 is likely to see far less of what markets are hoping for and far more in a way of volatility as revolutionary movements kick into gear that challenge the status quo as we grope our way towards a new paradigm. Some of these movements will get things right. Some of these revolutionaries or revolutionary movements will get it wrong. They'll make mistakes, but it needs to get started and it will get started. So pretty much everything needs to change if we are to achieve what we need to achieve, right? And that means less inequality, more stable energy, more importantly, productivity, wealth equality, etc. So what I'm going to finish up here on is just cover this real quick. We're going to talk a lot more about this. We're moving into social revolution. But what is social revolution? A lot of people say, I know what revolution is. Nah, they don't. You know, a lot of my students go, I understand revolution, and they can't give me more than a half a sentence. So let me explain to you what real social revolution is. Social revolutions in general are sudden changes in the structure and nature of society. These revolutions are usually recognized as having transformed society, economy, culture, philosophy, and technology, along with, but more than just the political system. American political scientist Samuel P. Huntington's definition of a social revolution is, quote, a rapid, fundamental, and violent domestic change in the dominant values and myths of a society and its political institutions, social structure, leadership, and government activities and policies, close quote. So essentially, social revolutions are essentially popular uprisings that transforms an existing socioeconomic and political order. Now, the underpinnings have to do with a number of things, like class struggle or conflict between different social classes, especially when you have growing wealth inequality with different access to resources. This is an important explanation as to why or what's the underpinning behind these revolutions and why they occur. So if you think of it this way, if a society is very unequal, it becomes more and more unequal in regards to wealth and privilege, it's likely that there are many people in it who are discontent. That makes sense, right? So this can create anger directed at the people in power, directed at elites, leading to a social uprising of some kind. Also, shifts in a culture can cause revolutionary change. Sometimes people begin to feel troubled by dominant cultural values or norms that are being promulgated by the establishment institutions, such as schools and universities. And this can bring about change. So one example here is the 60s counterculture revolution. It actually started a little bit earlier here, but this is the moment when the Uranus-Pluto conjunction occurred exactly on October 9th, 1965. And by that time, things were really, really cooking. It was really clear there was a counterculture revolution going full throttle, but it actually occurred a little bit earlier than that. I'm not going to go into that, but what we see, what certainly by the time we hit the fall of 65, when the counterculture revolution was really humming along, is when we saw birth control and women's sexuality was being discussed much more openly. Women were having active sexual intercourse at record-breaking numbers outside of marriage. And there was a lot less judgment than in previous eras. So the availability of new and more effective forms of birth control were a key underpinning of the sexual emancipation and sexual revolution that followed. So the notion of recreational sex without the threat of unwanted pregnancy radically changed the social dynamic and permitted both women and men much greater freedom in the selection of sexual lifestyles outside the confines of traditional marriage. As the 1960s progressed, certainly by the time we get to 65, Widespread social tensions also developed concerning other issues and tended to flow along generational lines regarding human sexuality, women's rights, traditional modes of authority, traditional modes of living, experimentation with psychoactive drugs, and differing interpretations of the American dream. So many key movements related to these issues were born or advanced with the counterculture of the 1960s. And we saw the movement, which basically started in San Francisco. It quickly spread to New York, where it was brewing for a while. And then by the mid 60s, the movement took hold in Western Europe, in London, Amsterdam, Paris, Rome, Milan, Copenhagen, West Berlin, rivaling that of San Francisco and New York counterculture scenes. For example, the UK underground was a movement linked to the growing subculture in the US and associated with the hippie phenomenon, generating its own magazines and newspapers, fashions, music groups, and clubs. Underground author figure Barry Miles, here's a quote. He said that the underground was a catch-all soubrequet for a community of like-minded anti-establishment, anti-war, pro-rock and roll individuals, most of whom had had a common interest in recreational drugs. They saw peace, exploring a widened area of consciousness, love, and sexual experimentation as more worthy of their attention than entering the middle-class rat race. The straight consumer lifestyle was not to their liking, but they did not object to others living it. But at that time, the middle class still felt that they had the right to impose their values on everyone else, which resulted in the conflict. Close quote. So we could see this is an idea of what a social revolution is. This type of countercultural revolution was a light socioeconomic revolution. The much harder ones are the ones where we see spontaneous social revolutions, which are planned or spontaneous. So we see a spontaneous one, the list here starting from 1789 with the French Revolution through the Tunisian, Egyptian Revolution, 2011, called the Arab Spring, where we see with spontaneous revolutions when a revolutionary is ignited without any significant organized effort. These type of revolutions, these spontaneous revolutions seem to occur when the military is acquiescent or supportive of the popular uprising. Here's a chart of the Arab Spring, where we saw 17, 18 nations within days, right, overthrow these fundamentalist Islamic governments. So that started December 17, 2010, around noon. I used to have the exact time, but it's not important for what we're discussing here, in Cairo, Egypt. So we see the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction here. I find that pretty interesting because we're going to have a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction very soon. So then you had the planned social revolution, and this seems to exist when the military is overpowered or defeated. So in addition to organizational strength, popular support, resources, and ideology seem to influence a planned revolution. So if we look at the top 10 revolutions felt around the world, the word revolution means turnaround. It's a fundamental change in power and organization structures that take place over a relatively short period of time.
To watch the full presentation and more like this on geopolitics, the economy, and world events from an archetypal and mundane astrological perspective, join the Global Transformation Astrology membership. Go to gta.williamstickevers.com. Become a GTA member today.